So keep that in mind. The digestive process actually begins in your mouth immediately. You have saliva. But you're also doing mechanical breakdown because you're chewing, right? You're breaking it up with your teeth. You're also using your cheek muscles, your tongue muscles, your oral muscles, everything to like manipulate the food, and then you swallow it. The esophagus, however, is simply for propulsion. That's all it's for. It's just getting from A to B. It does no absorption or breakdown. It's just getting it from A to B. Then you get to the stomach, and then you'll notice there's lots of digestion happening, lots of mechanical breakdown happening. That's when your stomach is churning, so to speak. The stomach is full of many layers of smooth muscle, right? It's a really buff, smooth muscle organ. So this is why it has all those layers of smooth muscle. And then we're moving on to the small intestine, but my next picture, I think, highlights it a little better. You take the food in, you start to immediately break it down here, both mechanically and chemically, because you have saliva and teeth and muscles. And then you swallow it, and this is just for propulsion, and then mechanical and chemical breakdown happens again here with the smooth muscle of your stomach and the stomach acids, which is the chemical part. And then it's gonna head to the duodenum, where it's gonna begin to absorb things, namely food molecules. Something else to keep in mind, because these tubes are all lined with smooth muscle, and your alimentary canal has, except for the stomach, which has expanded tunics of smooth muscle, everything else has like longitudinal and circular muscles, which I'll show you pictures of, and it allows your body to do two different processes. So the left is peristalsis. This is where it's using your smooth muscles to push the food more distal down your alimentary canal. And then you can also do segmentation, which is a way to mix and segment your food. Segmentation is very much illustrated in the descending colon of your rabbits, right? Whenever they have little fecal balls, right? So that's a very nice, clear example of segmentation. But it's just all of this is governed by autonomic control, right? So it's all smooth muscles doing this, not skeletal muscles. Cool, moving on. So we were here, right? And then we've moved into the small intestine. And there's some variation, but for the most part, it's lots of propulsion, of course, the whole time. And then there's a little bit of mechanical breakdown because there's smooth muscles that are like squeezing it, like this process, right? This is a form of mechanical breakdown as well. And then it's also going to be absorbing or digesting material. Depending on where you are in that tube, it's going to change its function. So in humans, a majority of the small intestine is for absorbing all the food, the molecules that we actually use for energy. And then once it gets to the large intestine, it's a lot of water reabsorption. And so this is where they're taking the waste and starting to dehydrate it so it solidifies so that it's easier to defecate. So you don't have like diarrhea, right? And then of course the final part right here where the anus is, there'll be a rectum right there. This is where the exit is, where defecation occurs. Before I talk about that, how are we feeling about this diagram? Any questions about it?
Did you say large intestine is where dehydration happens? No.
The color-coded based on
Oh, I guess so, yeah.
function. Yeah.
The water droplet, is that just showing
Digestion.
saliva in?
No, it's just a symbol they chose. It's kind of, I agree, that's a little misleading. It's just absorbing food molecules. That's where absorption of food molecules is occurring.
The small intestine.
Yeah, and then you'll notice right here, let me use my laser pointer. This is where water is involved.
Match at school bus.
Mainly H2O. Now, there would be saliva like mixed in with all of this because you're swallowing your saliva, so it's going to go along the journey. But the saliva that is not being secreted by other parts of your body. It's coming from your oral cavity only. But you always are swallowing your saliva. So. Now, because we are looking at a non-human, particularly an herbivore, herbivore digestion is actually really cool. It's really fascinating because mammals, I've said this a few times, but mammals are metabolically incapable of breaking down a molecule in plants called cellulose, so that's fiber. That's the more accurate, more scientific name for fiber. The walls of plant cells are lined with this molecule, and so it's the huge component of plant material. So when we eat plant material as an omnivore, we're really not getting much caloric value out of that. It's what allows us to be regular, because it's just the fiber just goes right through us, right? And it helps just keep us regular. However, if you're like a rabbit, or a horse, or a kangaroo, or a cow, where you're exclusively living off of like grass, leaves, things like that, branches, you need to get calories out of this. And so you'll see that they have huge, giant cavities, like big cul-de-sacs, coming off of their digestive system, either in the stomach region or in like the rabbit. This is the cecum of a horse. So horses and rabbits have fairly similar digestion. So you can see very simple small intestine, and then all the breakdown of the sugars has to happen here because they have this giant cecum or rumen in their stomach to accommodate microbes. They have a whole community of microorganisms, the kinds of organisms you'll learn about in microbiology if that's on your track. Depends on your major. But yeah, it just houses non-mammals that they actually have the physiological mechanisms to break down cellulose. So they have like little visitors, it's a little relationship, a mutualistic relationship. We also have biota, like flora in our gut, but these flora we don't house ones that break down cellulose. We house ones that maybe break down lactose and things like that. But herbivores come in two flavors. They either are fermenting in their stomach, so a cow is like this, or they're fermenting in their intestines, like the rabbit or the horse with the cecum. But you can see it's large, and then you see all of these little like ribs-like structures. Inside there'd be little septa, like little folds. It's just evidence of more surface area, right? These are just really high surface area structures. Carnivore, on the other hand, look at how simple that is. We used to dissect cats back in the day. That's what I learned anatomy off of. They're just harder to get a hold of now. And their digestive tract is pretty simple. It's not as complex to look at because meat is not hard to break down metabolically. The hard part about being a carnivore has everything to do with getting and killing it. Being an herbivore, that's easy, right? Plants can't move. They just show up, and the battle actually begins with plants the moment they put it in their mouth. That's when the battle begins. That's why a lot of plants have like nasty tastes and things like that. They're just trying to avoid being eaten. Yeah?
So basically, herbivores are just, their digestive process is just for function.
But they also are going to take lipids and carbohydrates. But now this is stuff maybe in like an upper division comparative anatomy class, which is not what we're in right now, but there would have to be different functions along this tube, because if you think about it, in this pony right here, the fiber is not going to be broken down in the small intestine, so it's not going to be absorbing sugars here. It's probably just absorbing proteins and lipids. Then it's going to be absorbing its sugars, probably in its colon. Probably similar to the rabbit. So the ascending colon of your rabbit is probably absorbing sugars before it starts to dehydrate and turn into feces. So, structure correlates to function. And then an omnivore, like a pig, we are also an omnivore, is going to have an intermediate. So our colon actually is somewhat ribbed, and there's a little bit more going on. But I would say pigs are a lot more omnivorous than us, at least metabolically. You can feed them like eggshells and like whatever. They're garbage disposals. They just eat everything. They're very resilient. That's why pigs are full of parasites usually. So they eat everything. So if you were to think about these different diets, a human compared to our rabbit that we've been cutting into, which one has a higher surface to volume ratio of its alimentary canal? A human or a rabbit? Which one has a higher surface to volume ratio? The human or the rabbit? Rabbit, correct. We have a lower surface to volume ratio. Now let's compare a dog to us. The dog versus the human. Which one has a higher surface to volume ratio? The human. Does that make sense? You're an obligate or complete carnivore, you don't need a lot of real estate to deal with that. The meat's really easy. If you're an obligate herbivore, you need lots of real estate. This is why when you look at herbivores, especially large ones like cattle, beasts of burden, their bodies look super boxy, right? Because they're full of guts. Like they have huge gut tubes. They're massive. Okay. So a little bit bit of an aside. So we are inside a cavity called the peritoneal cavity. That's the more scientific term for the abdomen. And it is like all the other body cavities lined with serosa. So remember, when you're thinking about serosa, if it's lining the organs inside the body cavity, we call it visceral. And if it's lining the wall, we call it parietal. Visceral, parietal, and then mesenteric. Should I put a V, a P, or an M with a line I just made? Parietal, so a P, yeah, the P, that's parietal. And then this is an organ, so that should be a visceral, yeah. And then this is a newish concept, that's a mesentery. A mesentery is when two serous membranes will like anneal to each other, and they create a little wall. When you've been dissecting your rabbits, assuming you've been careful, it's all of that transparent stuff that's kind of holding the gut tube together, right? Some of you might have ripped it as you've worked, that's fine, but that's a mesentery. It's kind of to hold everything together. But those mesenteries are made out of serous membranes. But they're neither visceral nor parietal, so you just call it a mesentery. So this is a fluid-filled space. It's for lubricating the organs, right? This is to make sure when you're moving, your gut tube is not going to cause friction, right? Friction would cause damage. So whenever you're bending over, moving around, running, right, your organs are not going to like start to get damaged and wear away. So it's very functionally similar to the other body cavity issues, right? It's all that lubricating and then also isolating pressure, right? So if your abdomen were to take a hit, right, the fact that it's in its own cavity is going to make sure that that pressure wave doesn't hit something more vulnerable, like in your thoracic cage where your heart and your lungs are, right? Now, a very nasty type of infection that can occur inside this cavity is called peritonitis. So it's just itis means inflammation of the peritoneum. This is usually caused by a perforation. So some due to an ulcer and or an injury, right? Some traumatic car accident, something like that, right? The alimentary canal gets ruptured and all the flora, right, the bacteria that are normally hanging out inside your alimentary canal get into that sterile peritoneal cavity. The peritoneal cavity should be sterile. And then it gets filled, and then think about it, it's warm, it's protected, and the bacteria just have a heyday. They just start to, and I actually never watched videos, but I imagine it's quite a nasty surgery. You have to have like mega doses of antibiotics to get rid of it, and if it's bad enough, they have to cut you open and literally scoop out the rotten tissue, like for peritonitis. This is why, like a ruptured bowel, if you've ever heard of that, that's why that's life-threatening. Like a ruptured bowel is like, go to the ER now. Go to the ER now. Because you want to, you're allowed to have bacteria from mouth to anus, that's normal, because if you think about it, there's sphincters that seal it, but your mouth to anus is not free from the environment. It is routinely exposed to the environment because you're eating and pooping, right? So, but that peritoneal cavity should be completely sealed away, right? So it needs to stay nice and sterile. And I imagine it smells really nasty. Like an infection like that would have quite the odor. So. But that's why they pay general surgeons the big bucks, right? And all their team, right? All the surgical assistants and all that. Okay, so now we're gonna think about the alimentary canal as a whole, right? So just, we're generalizing here. I think technically, I don't know what part that would be. It doesn't look like small intestine, but yeah, it's just a general alimentary canal. So it's been dissected in various ways. It looks like the serous membrane has been reflected away at that superficial bit. But all of the alimentary canal has these following layers. So starting from deep, needs a different color. So this is deep, oh, that's not a deep. And then if we head this way, this is superficial. So the mucosa is the deepest, and then the serosa is the most superficial. I have slides for each, but it would be like mucosa right there. Here's the submucosa, which has actually its own little like layer of small muscle. small muscle, smooth muscle. Muscularis externa is where all of the bulk of the smooth muscle is located, and then the serosa is all of this beige stuff, where it's, see it's a single layer of epithelia right there. And look, here's the mesentery all zoomed in. Mesenteries, by the way, also are developmental like little landmarks. It's where blood vessels and nerves travel when they innervate your visceral organs. So you'll see, and you probably saw when you were dissecting the rabbit, inside those mesenteries are a whole bunch of tubes, right? So like when you go, if you're learning about the details of this part of the body, a lot of times mesenteries are great landmarks to figure out what's what. Like, oh, we need to approach from this vein or this artery or this nerve. They'll all be suspended and held together so they don't tangle. They don't get tangled, right, in the mesentery. Okay, the mucosal layer, I'll circle it in red, it's just all of these structures right here. I also have them right here. This is going to be secreting mucus, digestive enzymes. They also have some hormones. Remember when I talked about like the endocrine system is more than just those endocrine organs. There's patches of tissue all over your body that have endocrine function. I just found out this morning, your fat can be considered an endocrine organ. Like the fat inside your body secretes hormones. So it's like an organ. And that's why like if obesity can cause like those hormones to get overly secreted and it causes imbalances. Very interesting. But yeah, you can view fat as an organ, not just a tissue. Okay, brain. Yeah, it's absorbing stuff depending on where it is, right? And it's also going to be protecting. So there are going to be these regions. Actually, one of them right here, these little mid-green regions. This is the more the lymphatic system. I don't really emphasize the lymphatic system too much, but these are called MALT organs. Mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues, or MALT regions. The acronym is MALT, but think about it. You have the body interfacing with your environment by eating things, and so there's potential for pathogens to get into your body via this canal. So there's going to be like a little area of your lymphatic system to patrol, right? It's for patrolling, making sure that those pathogens don't get into your bloodstream, which is going to be here. But yeah, it's the epithelia, lamina propria, and then a muscularis mucosa. No, I move on. So the epithelium is that little pink bit right here is literally epithelial tissue. The lamina propria is connective tissue, which is where all of the glands are like suspended in. But remember, the glands are all going to be epithelial in origin, but they're going to be, it's a very similar pattern to like the epidermis and the dermis. And then the muscularis mucosa, this is smooth muscle that will squeeze and help these glands release their secretions via their ducts, right? Like wringing out a towel, right? That's what this little, a wet towel, that's what this little layer is doing. Remember, this is like a generalized alimentary canal, so as you move through the whole tube, the relative contributions of these different functions will change. Now, the submucosa is going a little more superficial. This is all loose or real our connective tissue. That's all this right here. So let me circle the submucosa on my little diagram. So it's going to have lymph vessels, blood vessels, any nerves that are going to be innervating the smooth muscle, both superficial and deep to it, and then a lot of elastic tissues because you're going to have digestible material being pushed through this tube, and so the diameter of the tube will be changing as you eat. Right? So it does need to be able to recoil back to its original diameter, hence the need for elastic fibers. Now, the muscularis externa is two muscle layers, but they're both made out of smooth muscle. The only difference between the two, so there's the circular layer, right, and the longitudinal layer, is the direction of the fibers. So the circular layer, which is more deep, is going to have fibers running around the tube, around the alimentary canal. now, kind of like how I'm orienting it like this. Where you can see when you slice through the circular layer like this, it looks long ways, it doesn't like that, the opposite. And then you move to the superficial layer above that, the longitudinal layer, and it's a 90-degree angle, right? The fibers are running it at like a complete 90 degree to the circular layer. The longitudinal layer is responsible for shortening, and then when it relaxes, lengthening the alimentary tube. So in combination, both of these layers are what allow peristalsis and segmentation to occur. And fun fact, this is how like an earthworm moves too. Earthworms will have a circular and longitudinal layer around their bodies, and they'll just alternate using those to squeeze and shorten, so that's how worms move. And then there are some areas where they're much thicker, so an example would be like the pyloric sphincter or the ileocecal valve. It's just thicker bundles of the circular muscle. The circular layer it makes more sense to be a sphincter because it's already wrapped around in a circle around the tube. Right? So you just thicken it up, and now it's a sphincter. And then finally, the serosa. I don't really say too much, but it's just epithelium. Right? The serosa is just lining everything, right? But we have serosa lining our heart, we have serosa lining our lung, we have serosa lining our liver, it's everywhere. Okay, and here are some real photos of the layers we're talking about. So this is both smooth muscle, it's just again the direction of the fibers that determines their name. So we have longitudinal layer, and that's only if you slice through it long ways. So like the cross section, losing my voice a little bit. The cross section is coming from this slice, like the tube was sliced long ways. And you can see the fibers are all kind of facing you, so it all looks like a little stipple pattern, like a dotting pattern. And then in that same cross section, you would see a circular layer where the fibers are all running lengthwise this way. So these are all smooth muscles though. It's just, again, the difference is the direction of the fibers. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about this. I believe in physiology you go into more depth about this, but smooth muscle cells are quite different than other muscle cells in how they contract. So cardiac muscle cells and skeletal muscle cells are packed full of those myofilaments that are in the bulk inside the cytoplasm of the cell, and most of the volume of that cell are those sticks, right? Whenever you look at a smooth muscle, it's actually a network of fibers that are kind of wrapped around the cell like a mesh. And they still shorten, and they still cause the whole cell to shorten, but see the mechanism's a little different. So you'll have these little dense bodies, which are just little circles, right, which will cause these fibers right here, the intermediate filaments, to just shorten, and then it causes the whole cell to squeeze smaller like this. This is why smooth muscle cells are much weaker. There's literally just less fibers. That's why you don't see these fibers under the microscope. And then you'll learn about the physiology of how it works in 22. Got ahead of myself. I do have a serosa slide. I was just went on a side note to talk about muscle. So the serosa is made up of that visceral peritoneum, right? Because it's just the serosa lining the visceral organs themselves. It's got some areolar connective tissue, and then it has simple squamous epithelia for most organs. The only exception to this is the esophagus. The esophagus has a really thick adventitia, which is really fibrous, and it's going to help that esophagus keep its structure when you're swallowing. And when you were messing with your rabbits in their neck region, right, you were scraping away with probes, either your finger or other types of probes, right, all the collagen fibers to get it out and expose it. And then here is the real thing. So this looks like small intestine, probably. Yeah. And you can see that we've actually looked at things like this during the histology lab. We were just not focusing on it at the organ level. You were just trying to wrap your head around cell shapes, cell arrangements, And then is it smooth muscle, is it connective tissue, right? But now we're gonna look at it at the organ level. So you can see the mucosa at the top, which is an epithelia, and it looks like here, this is all columnar epithelia. That's why I'm thinking this is the small intestine. And then there's the submucosa, there's some connective tissue in here, and then look, these are all glands. This is all glandular epithelia, and you can even see a little bit of their lumens, the little white spaces, those are the ducts. And they're all gonna feed into this cavity, excuse me. And you can see the muscularis externa, both circular and longitudinal. Do you see how they're like 90 degrees to each other? And then the serosa is under the microscope, it's gonna be barely visible. Like it looks like the serosa got a little shredded. So that's why it's, you'll have to look at the PowerPoint that's posted. Me looking up there, it's hard to see, but you just see a little shrapnel, little pieces of cells. In life, this would have been a nice continuous layer. Just the slicing process probably ripped this up. So this would be known as an artifact, right? Here's artifacts too, right? Look, it looks like the submucosa and the muscularis externa got separated right there. Yeah. So the whole gut tube can be broken into these layers. The difference is the relative thickness and the morphology of each layer will change as you move through the alimentary canal. So that's what we're going to focus on next. Yeah. Okay, when you think about the alimentary canal, you can break it into these regions, starting from most, I guess, proximal to distal, I guess you could use that term, or in, I guess, superior to inferior, but it's kind of misleading to say that because if you think about it, there's a colon, an ascending region that is going superior. So I use proximal versus distal because if you think about it, the tube is like attached right there. So, but oral cavity, pharynx, that's all this region. Esophagus is right here. Stomach. And then that all this smaller tubing is small intestine. And then look at our large intestine, it's quite ribbed. And then it exits the body. So we're going to start our journey with the oral cavity. We've actually looked at this region a number of times. We looked at it during the, I guess, the cranial nerve stuff, and then mainly during the respiratory system when we were focusing more on this windpipe. But remember, the oral cavity and the oral pharynx is also involved in food transport and manipulation. So oral cavity, oral pharynx, but then when swallowing occurs, the solid food is going to push, and the muscles will help, it's going to push that epiglottis inferiorly and seal the trachea or the larynx, sorry, seal the larynx shut so the food only goes down the esophagus. And this is why we need all that Heimlich remover and everything, this little crisscross, it's really strange. And then teeth, I don't really go into teeth too much, but there's obviously a whole discipline dedicated to teeth dentistry. They're really complex, high maintenance organs. So, teeth. And then there's salivary glands. I don't think any are shown. These are tonsils. Tonsils have to do with your immune system, but I don't see any salivary glands. But those are just going to be exocrine glands secreting saliva, right? Which have digestive enzymes and water. This is a little gift showing when you swallow why, as long as everything works correctly and you don't accidentally like laugh while you're swallowing and then inhale food, it will swing shut and then boom, go down the esophagus instead of the trachea. And then it's really strange. Like, look, you have the journey, the air goes this way, and then the journey, let's unpause. To give the journey that air goes, air is going to go like that. So if I were to draw like air, and then let's make food red. Food travels this way. You'll notice, look, they crisscross right here. That is not very effective at all, as exemplified by all the choking that happens in humans, right? But that is a vestige of our ancestry. It has to do with the fact that we used to be fish. Because it would make much more sense to have your esophagus be more anterior and your trachea be more posterior, and then seal off, like literally create a wall right here, so that you would be able to eat and breathe at the exact same time. Like, but we can't do that. So, choking. But it's just because of something called phylogenetic inertia, phylogenetic constraint. Our anatomy is very much informed by our ancestry. Chris Rock. Journey food tape. Oh, now my drawings don't make any sense. Okay. So now what we're gonna do is look at a histological tour of all the different regions after the oral cavity. So the oral cavity, if you remember, is just mostly lined with stratified squamous epithelia for friction, abrasion, dealing with abrasion. When you look at the esophagus, again, it's gonna have all those same regions. You can see the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and then because it's the esophagus, instead of having a serosa, it's gonna have an adventitia. If you look at the right picture, let me get my laser pointer. This is where the esophagus and the stomach are actually meeting. The esophagus is going to be primarily lined with stratified squamous epithelia. Can anyone think why? Why would the esophagus be lined with stratified squamous epithelia? Think about the job of the esophagus or the function of the esophagus.
So that food doesn't seep out.
Okay, partly protection, okay. And then where else is stratified squamous epithelia in the body?
Everywhere.
Like your skin? What's that, Ruby?
So is it because, like you said, it's maybe for propulsion to push it into the stomach while the living digestion will happen? Is that why?
That's maybe not the exact reason why, but think about you're swallowing constantly, food is rubbing against that. That's, yeah. So yeah, protection both from leakage, but also just make sure you don't cause a laceration or anything like that. So it just needs to be a thick layer. And then it's gonna have a whole bunch of muscles, because the smooth muscles are what allow you to swallow. Well, you have skeletal muscles that initiate swallowing, but then the esophagus will continue that journey. Moving on to the stomach's most hallmark region is absolutely the muscularis externa. It doesn't just have a longitudinal and an oblique layer, so I'm gonna pull your attention to this region right there, those terms. You'll see there's also a oblique layer. So there's a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and then there's a third layer. Additional layers of muscle just means it has additional functions, it's stronger, right? It can manipulate the food better. This is going to be for storing and mushing the food and helping it break down more, right? There's gonna be a lot of stomach acid being secreted. I'll talk about that in a second with the epithelia, but the stomach is very much exemplified by that big, three-layered muscularis externa. And then you'll see the stomach has a lot of folds. We call these the rugae of the stomach. And these folds, just a lot more surface area, and then as the stomach stretches, those rugae will no longer be folds. So it's just also to allow the stomach to have, the stomach will be full, it can get big, and then whenever you're done, the food has moved on to the next part of the digestive cavity and alimentary canal, and then it can retract, and then the rugae will come back. Cool, so now here is histological. Well, I have a real picture next, but histology is always messy, so it's nice to look at the perfect, this is a little fake, or all very fake. But you can see there's actually these pits in the epithelia, allowing the epithelia to dive deeper into the stomach, again, just to increase surface area. And that is lined with mostly mucus cells. But then as you get deeper into these pits, there's actually a whole bunch of cells with various functions, and they're color-coded. You can look over here, here's the circular layer, longitudinal layer, oblique layer, submucosa is right there, muscularis mucosa is right there. So all those layers we talked about in the alimentary canal are still present, but they're just modified. They look different because this has a specific function. As we move through the tube, all these layers will still be present, they're just gonna be modified. Yeah, so some of these cells are secreting hydrochloric acid or just hydrogen ions, really. Some of these are secreting like enzymes, some of them are secreting hormones. There's actually a whole bunch of different functions going on here. Yeah, so this is showing them. So you look into one of these pits, and you'll have some of these cells, these are actually secreting HCl, hydrochloric acid. So the stomach acid comes from here. These chief cells, however, are secreting something called trypsinogen. In the presence, this is maybe a little bit of physiology light. In the presence of a really acidic environment, so this is some chemistry, it will then turn pepsinogen into pepsin. And pepsin is really good for breaking down protein. And then there's also some enteroendocrine cells. So these are not directly related to digestion. These are more related to hormones. These are secreting hormones. And it has a duct right there. Or it's the pit, but it is a little pit. And then the real thing's right here. So you can see this is where the alimentary canal would be. You can see the mucosal layer here with the mucus secreting cells. The HCl secreting parietal cells are a little deeper, and then at the very end, the deepest part is the enzyme secreting cells, which secrete that pepsinogen. And then now we're moved on to muscle layer. And you can see the little pits, all the gastric pits. How are we feeling about the stomach? And you'll notice histologically they're mostly cuboidal-ish cells that secrete things. The stomach's mostly, the epithelia is mostly cuboidal. Moving on to the small intestine, this is a very wonderful example of maximizing surface area for a given volume. It basically just folds upon folds upon folds upon folds upon folds. It's almost like a fractal, if you've ever learned about fractals in like math. So this is at the organ level. Look at the serous layer, the serosa. It has two muscular layers, so it'll be a circular layer, longitudinal layer. It's going to have the submucosa and the mucosa. When you specifically look at the mucosal layer, you can see it's folded into these folds that we call villi. And then on each villus will be a microvilli. And then I believe the cells themselves also then have, oh no, that's the microvilli part. So it's folds upon folds upon folds. So, and we'll zoom in a little more. So if you were to, this is an endoscopic view, so a little camera. You can see it looks all brushy and fuzzy because it's just folds upon folds upon folds. This makes sense given its function, right? It's mostly for absorption. So it's just trying to maximize surface area because at this stage of digestion, everything should be a juicy liquid, right? There should be no solids passing through here, or at least solids that you need to deal with. You can absolutely get things that just go right through your body. But, so at this stage, it's just trying to get the digestible molecules, the molecules that are useful for energy, out of that soup into your bloodstream. And when you look closely, here we go. So we have the villi, there we go. And then on one villi, you'll have a number of villuses. And then you'll have microvilli on the actual cells themselves. So a fold, and that fold has many folds, and then each of these folds has cells with little folds on them. So it's just folds on folds on folds. And now I'm hoping you can appreciate, based on the structure of these columnar cells, right? These are columnar, they're just for absorption. And then the real thing, you've seen this in lab. This is just colored differently, but this would be one of the villi, and then each villi is lined with a layer of epithelial cells. We call them columnar epithelia, right? And those columnar epithelia are then going to be lined on their apical surface with microvilli. There are goblet cells, sparse amounts, but there are goblet cells in between these that secrete mucus. Goblet cells are a single-celled gland that secretes mucus. And then look, you can see the submucosal layer right here. It's starting to disappear. I can't turn off the rainbow, it looks nice. The tech came and told me, or they, IT knows about it and they'll be working on it hopefully. Moving on to the large intestine. Oh, and then now that we've looked at the rabbit officially, I just want to help translate it to humans. There's the very end of the small intestine. Here's the ileum. And then this is our cecum. We have just a little teeny pouch of a cecum and then an appendix. And then there is the colon. That's that three-way like fork in the road I was talking about. It's just bigger in rabbits because the cecum in rabbits is massive, right? It's massive because they're herbivores, right? It's because they're herbivores. But yeah, so this whole region is, for the most part, it's just trying to dehydrate the waste now. So it's just trying to take that soup and turn it into something more solid so you can defecate. So we have the ascending, transverse, and descending colon in humans. So ours does like a little U-turn. And then there'll be a rectum. This is like a storage container. If you have that feeling like, oh, I need to go number 2, right? It's because your rectum is full, and you'll have all these autonomic nerves that are like sensing right here. And then the anus is the actual like sphincter that will initiate defecation. This is a close-up of the rectum and anus, and there's a little valve right here that separates the rectum from the anus, so the rectum would be right here, and then here's the anal canal. This is what will relax whenever your body has decided, autonomically, has decided it's time to go to the bathroom, right? And then it'll be in here, and then that's when you're like, oh, I gotta go. And then there's a little sphincter, smooth muscle here. Also keep in mind, these are hemorrhoidal veins. If you get hemorrhoids, it's just these veins like getting a pooling of blood and they like pooch out and you get little like polyps, right? But it's just the veins starting to stretch and fill with more blood. So, and this is if you're like constipated and you're defecating a lot and you're using your muscles, your pelvic floor muscles a lot, so you're creating a lot of positive pressure in this region. That's how you can get hemorrhoids. You can get both internal hemorrhoids and external hemorrhoids. And there's a whole bunch of videos on like how to remove those if you're curious, both just by changing your diet, but if it's bad enough, they might have to go in and surgically like tie them off. They tie off the hemorrhoids with like a little rubber band and it like cuts off the blood supply and then it'll just like wither away and fall. When you look at the epithelia of the large intestine, it also has columnar cells, but their function is different than the columnar cells of the small intestine. Right, so the small intestine, they were called enterocytes, and they absorb. The large intestine, they're called colonocytes, and they absorb water. They're not absorbing food, they're absorbing water. So they're trying to dehydrate the contents of the alimentary canal. And then another thing to note, do you see all these large orbs that are kind of like transparent everywhere? These are goblet cells. So way more, significantly more goblet cells in your colon. This is to secrete mucus, and it's to help bundle up and ease the transport of feces. So you have, in a healthy digestive tract, you have a lot of mucus in your colon. That's normal. It's very healthy to have mucus in your colon. And then once again, muscularis mucosa, right, and then it keeps going. So it has all those same layers. I'm just trying to highlight the differences between all the layers, if that makes sense. Do you see lots of goblet cells, and then we go back to the small intestine, less goblet cells, way less. So mucus is still being secreted here, but that's not the primary function of this region. The enterocytes are trying to absorb food. Okay, so now the overview. This is just a nice table showing the anatomy mixed with the functions of everything, both in like diagram form and like bullet point form. And it just starts from the oral cavity, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, then it keeps going. I just can't fit the whole diagram on one page. Your book has this as one giant beautiful diagram, so it's really nice. But we've been talking about this, or I have throughout this whole lecture, so this is, I would view this as more of a reference, if that makes sense, to help guide your studying. So you can see like the mouth, ingestion's happening there, propulsion's happening there, mechanical breakdown's happening there, and digestion's happening in the oral cavity. I like how this diagram shows that. Why do we have digestion starting, like molecular digestion starting in the oral cavity? What anatomical features allow for that? Nadia?
Basically, the enzymes.
The spit, the saliva, yeah, the salivary glands to be more like anatomy about it, but yes, spit. But the salivary glands is secreting saliva, which has enzymes in it. That's why we can add that like magenta purple digestion to the oral cavity. Notice we move on to the esophagus, it's just propulsion. We go to the stomach, and then it's everything again, and a little bit of absorption that's happening. Yeah, a little bit. And then we move on to the small intestine. I went backwards. Small intestine, all the functions are happening. Mechanical breakdown and propulsion, digestion, absorption. It's telling you what organs are involved. And then the large intestine is now mostly just propulsion and absorption. Yeah, absorption. Absorption this time though, not of food molecules, but what? What's the large intestine's main job?
Water.
Absorbing water, yeah, it's trying to dehydrate the contents of the alimentary canal. And then finally, in the rectum anus region, defecation is occurring. Whereas ingestion is at the very beginning. So those are some unique processes. Taking in your food, getting rid of your waste. And then a very similar diagram, I think it's the whole, yeah, has the breakdown of the histology as well. So it has the real picture, a nice diagram that's emphasizing everything a little more clearly, and then it just has a description of these cells and their jobs. So you can see the alimentary canal in the esophageal region is just a stratified squamous epithelium. It's just for propulsion, so it's just to make sure that it gets from A to B without lacerating or rupturing, right, your alimentary canal. Because a lot of friction is happening when you're swallowing, right? Then you get to the stomach and it has a whole bunch of cells, but they're all collectively just secreting things to aid in the mechanical, not the mechanical, the chemical breakdown of your food. And then the muscle layers are the ones that are doing the mechanical breakdown. So this includes mucus cells, parietal cells, chief cells, and all their secretions are listed in that little table right there. You can see all their cute little organelles. We move on to the small intestine. The main player right here is the enterocytes that are lined with the microvilli. Those are absorbing the food. Then we also have goblet cells that are going to be secreting mucus. You don't need to worry too much about this. Enteroendocrine cells and the Paneth cells, but they do exist. You might learn about it in physiology. Then we move on to the large intestine, and now the colonocytes. Notice they're very similar structure because they're both absorbing. The only difference is these are absorbing water and these are absorbing food. Yes? Does that make sense? But then it has goblet cells. See, it's the exact same cell, just more of them. Way less, more. Okay, how are we feeling about these things? Going to be superimposing a little bit of histology with the digestive system, so make sure you understand like cell shapes, cell arrangements idea, and how it relates to function, because that will help you understand the alimentary canal. Mostly just transitions and epithelia. The epithelia are mostly doing the changing. Okay. So moving on to the enteric nervous system. So now we're zoomed out. This is a picture of your gut tube. So the esophagus is up top right there, and then it looks like it's part of the small intestine, and that's it. It doesn't go all the way. But it's just trying to illustrate it's highly, highly innervated by your nervous system. We call this the enteric nervous system. It's a branch of your autonomic nervous system. And this is where you get the idea of like a gut-brain axis. And fun fact, you actually have more nerves in your GI tract than you do in your spinal cord. So it's highly innervated, highly innervated. So that like term "you are what you eat" is probably related to this idea. Like depending on what you eat, all these nerves are gonna sense that, and like it might make you have a really good day or a really bad day, right? That makes sense. But you also have motility as well. So then there would be some autonomic motor control going on. Okay. Yeah, then you'll have the nerve plexus in the submucosal region. This is going to be regulating glands, and then any smooth muscle in the mucosa. So that would be the like little thin muscle layer that is going to help squeeze the glands. And then of course the actual myenteric nerve plexus is what innervates the circular and longitudinal, and in the case of the stomach, also oblique layers of the muscle. So with the enteric nervous system, this is a little more nervous, but it's just something to talk about with the digestive system. There's reflex arcs involved in that your digestive system is involved in. You have short reflexes and long reflexes. So short reflexes where the whole stimulus pathway, so from input, integration, output, is entirely dealt with inside your enteric nervous system. So it's like you eat something, you swallow it, and then a few hours later your stomach's like, ooh, something's wrong, and then you throw up. That would be a short reflex. A long reflex is where the stimulus comes from outside of the gut. So this would be like maybe you smell something nasty and it makes you want to throw up, or you smell something nice and it makes you salivate and it makes your stomach go, like get all ready to go. But the emphasis on the stimulus coming from outside of the enteric nervous system. So I have a visual that illustrates this. And then of course remember the parasympathetic system enhances the digestive process, and then the sympathetic system inhibits the digestive process. So the rest and digest, parasympathetic, and then sympathetic is fight, flight, or freeze. You don't want to be digesting food when your body's trying to mobilize and deal with some kind of stimulus, like a predator or whatever, right? But here's the nice breakdown. So you can see this is a representation of the alimentary canal. Here's the lumen, and then here's our central nervous system right there. Short reflexes, you'll notice they never leave this area. So there'll be some kind of internal stimulus. Let's say there's also mechanoreceptors that can detect stretching. Short reflexes can also include like the choreography a lot of your smooth muscles go through to propel your food around. They're usually governed by short reflexes. It's just monitoring the relative stretch nearby on whether or not smooth muscles need to contract. And then different receptors are going to pick that up. So chemoreceptors, osmoreceptors are for like ion concentrations, and then which is just a kind of chemoreceptor, and then mechanoreceptors. And then there will be some kind of plexus, like a ganglia in your stomach. You can actually, let me go back to the beginning. You can actually see some of those ganglia, like the areas where there's a high density of nerve fibers. There's ganglia in your stomach that are like, you can think of them as like a brain for your stomach. And then effectors will happen, so it's either going to be smooth muscles or glands. So smooth muscles will propel the food, or smooth muscles make you throw up, or glands secrete more or secrete less. And then the response will be something, right? Either the change in the muscle's contractility or secretory activity of the glands. That's a short reflex. A long reflex, this is all the same, right? So it has to eventually get into a local nerve plexus in the alimentary canal, and then the effector organs are still the same. It's just the external stimulus could be something you see, something you smell, something you taste, or you can think of. You could just like think of something that makes you nauseous, right? If that makes sense, that would be a long reflex because your CNS is involved. If your CNS is involved, it's a long reflex. If your CNS is not involved, it's a short reflex. That makes sense? Yeah. Okay, so, any questions about the digestive system? You need me to go over any of the slides again?
lights are gonna